morning. Our first reading is a poem called Room by Reverend Sarah Speed. This comes along with some materials that we are working off of during the Advent season. So this is her own reflection, talking about all the things about herself that make her feel a little too much, but noticing that there's room for those. So maybe you'll resonate with some of them. Room. I asked God, what about my fingernail biting habit? Or the way I leave all the cabinets open in the kitchen? God said, you got to work on that. No, that's not part of the poem. That's my own thing. I asked God, what about my fingernail biting habit? Or the way I leave all the cabinets open in the kitchen? What about the way I can be dramatic, drumming up a fight only to hand out apologies like souvenirs? What about the way I second-guess myself, let shame drive, or stay quiet when I have something to say? What about the way I chase accomplishments like a dog with a bone? What about the doubt or the fact that I'm terrible at prayer and cannot help but yawn during church? I know the feeling. What about my baggage might be too big for the van? But then God called me by my first and middle name, which always means business, and said, who told you that you were too much? Sugar, there is so much room for you here. So that's when I grabbed a seat and we hit the road, and I knew right then that the rumors were true. There is room. There is room. There is room. That line, sugar, there's so much room for you here. That reminds me of when I moved onto my block in 2007. And the block mother, she was the block captain, I thought of her as the block mother. She called everyone sugar. That's how she greeted us. Sugar, it's so good to see you. Now I'm going to hear God's voice spoken with the voice of Miss Ruth from a couple doors down. In a typical Advent, we'd be reading this morning, our Bible reading would be one of the apocalyptic passages from the Gospels. The cycle of readings that we follow, which is called the Revised Common Lectionary, that's going to be on the quiz later, Revised Common Lectionary, just warning you. It does it that way because the people who organized it wanted to remind us that Advent isn't only about a pregnancy and a birth, although, we can be excited about a baby. We're always excited when there are babies here. But that baby that's at the heart of the story would become a teacher who would reveal things to us. And that's really what an apocalypse is. That's why they start us with these apocalypse passages. The Greek word that comes to us as apocalypse means uncovering. The gospel stories are about a teacher who takes the cover off to show us things about God and things about ourselves and things about our world, and to uncover different possibilities for living and for being in relationship. So the traditional way of starting Advent, I think of it as starting Advent with a bang, reminds us that underneath what is, there are other possibilities for what could be. What it doesn't do is give us a good sense of the build-up to that birth story that we're so interested in this time of year and so inspired by. So the materials that we're working with this year, they go outside the usual rotation of readings to do that, to give us a build-up to the story. We're using materials from a group called A Sanctified Art. That's where that poem came from. And their theme that they're working with this year is called From Generation to Generation. It's about passing things on. It's about stories. The stories we hold, the stories that make us, the stories we are making, the stories we've inherited, the stories that we're passing on. All of those tied up with the story of Jesus from generation to generation. And it starts this week with a list of generations. So buckle up, because our Bible reading this morning is a genealogy. From the very beginning of Matthew's Gospel. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. Good, we're partway there already. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. Everybody's hanging on the narrative, I can tell. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Salathiel, Salathiel the father of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. Those will all be on the quiz. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. This is Matthew's genealogy, the story of Jesus. It's a good thing we are not one of those churches where the pastors make one of the congregants read the scripture passage. If I gave that list of names to someone, they would never step foot back in this place. Genealogies are political and theological documents. For some people, they're a sign of privilege. Have you ever heard people talk about how their ancestors came here on the Mayflower or something? They trace their ancestry to bolster their own sense of self-importance. For some, they're more interesting. They're bits of self-knowledge. They place themselves inside a whole set of family stories. We got hints of that on All Saints Sunday. For instance, when Jaime invoked his grandfather here as the person who gave him his first piano. I love that story. For some, genealogies are painful because they can only trace back so far before the names and the stories get lost to displacement or disaster, or because white supremacy doesn't care about the names and stories of the people it enslaves and devours. In the ancient world, genealogies were used to prop up rulers. They showed that the ruler was important because they came from a whole long line of other important people. They're kind of like an American Kennel Club pedigree for emperors and kings, I guess. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke both offer genealogies of Jesus, and they each do it differently, which maybe reminds us that we're not in the realm of Ancestry.com. But the fact that they do it at all is a powerful statement that it wasn't just kings and emperors who count. Luke's genealogy includes 77 names, which is significant because the number 7 symbolizes wholeness, completion. So 2 7s, 77, is a symbol that this genealogy is about completion. Matthew also riffs on that same theme, just differently. He doesn't trace it all the way back to the story of Adam, which is what Luke does. But he does organize his genealogy into groups of 14 generations, 14 being a different way of seeing those two sevens, perfection and wholeness. And if you were paying close attention, this would have been the bonus point question on the quiz, you would have noticed that actually he wiggled with that because the third set offered only 13 generations, which is maybe a symbolic way of saying, hey, you reader who are carrying the story of Jesus now, it's your job to live into the wholeness. The really interesting thing about Matthew and how he does it is his little math trick means that he actually had to make some big choices. Every name in a genealogy is more than just a name, right? There are people behind those names, and people have stories. So Matthew's genealogy of Jesus is like a key to the stories of the Hebrew Bible. It tells Israel's story through the stories of people, and there were more generations than Matthew's counting would allow. So he left 5 people, 5 generations, 5 collections of stories out, and they were all kings. Kings who were made invisible in the service of a genealogy math trick. But maybe even more interesting than that is who gets included. Ancient genealogies usually traced the leaders' generations back through all the men. And that is mostly what Matthew does, except for the men that he left out. He drops out some of those kingly men and makes room in addition to Jesus' mother, Mary, makes room for 4 other women, Tamar, Rahab, Bathsheba, and Ruth. And they all have stories worth knowing. Although, looking at the makeup of who we are today, these first couple of stories I'm going to have to tell a little more delicately than I otherwise would have. The Bible is full of complex stories. All of these women are complicated characters. They're boundary crossers, they're rule breakers, they're inventive, they're resourceful women who found ways to survive inside systems that were not set up for them. Tamar exposed a gender double standard, which maybe we know something about these things still today. And she found out a way to exploit it. The genealogy it tells us that she gave birth to 2 children who were fathered by Judah. Matthew's readers knew that story. Judah was her father-in-law. She'd been married to his eldest son, who died without becoming a father with her. In the ancient Near East, this is a family system that's strange to us, but in the ancient Near East, when someone died, when an eldest son died without having children, his widow would then be married to the next oldest brother, whose job it was to continue the family line with children. The next older brother had no interest in fathering children that weren't going to be counted as his. So he also died without becoming a parent with Tamar, which made Tamar twice over widowed, which made her twice as vulnerable. Her father-in-law, Judah, had a 3rd son who was not yet of marriageable age, and he was a little bit nervous about this 3rd son after his first 2 sons had died. So he sent Tamar away. He said, go back and live as a widow with your family. Let them take care of you, however that works. When the 3rd son is of marriageable age, I'll send for you, and you'll be a cared for and protected woman again, and maybe you'll become a mother then. That did not happen. The 3rd son got to marriageable age, and nobody ever sent word to Tamar to say, hey, you can come back in and have the protected status of a married woman again. Well, when Tamar learned that her father-in-law was holding out on her and leaving her vulnerable, she took matters into her own hands by dressing as, we'll say, In the ancient world, there were women who worked at temples who were considered to have healing powers by being in touch with the deity. And they would offer those healing powers to men who made offerings in the temple through acts of intimacy. So she dressed as a healing worker in the temple, is how we'll say it this morning. The story says that as Judah came by, he didn't recognize her in her costume. So he thought that this was just a temple worker. So he made an economic transaction with her in exchange for her services, and then went on his way. Later, word came back to him that his daughter-in-law, Tamar, was pregnant. And boy, was he angry. She was not supposed to be doing that outside of the bounds of marriage to one of his sons. And so he called for her to be brought out and publicly put to death. But then she revealed who the father was. To his credit, he recognized that she was telling the truth, that he was in the wrong. In a patriarchal world, Tamar used her resourcefulness to claim power that had been denied to her. She became a big part of Israel's story, and then, as Matthew tells it, of the story of Jesus. No Jesus without Tamar. If you're keeping score at home on the chart of biblical values, that's one for non-traditional families. You might not be all that surprised to learn that the story of Tamar never shows up in the 3-year cycle of the Revised Common Lectionary. She doesn't get a whole lot of sermon time in churches. Rahab is another resourceful woman who claimed what power she could in a difficult situation. She was a Canaanite woman who worked for a temple, I think, and she lived in Jericho when Israel was getting ready to invade and settle the land. So she protected 2 Israelite spies who were nearly caught in the city, and for that they promised safety to her and to her whole multi-generational family. The act of providing safe harbor earns her a place of honor in the story of Israel. And again, as far as Matthew is concerned, there's no story of Jesus without the story of Rahab, the temple healing worker. She also does not show up in the 3-year preaching cycle, which makes you wonder about the men who put that together and how anxious they are about the power and resourcefulness of women. Wow, I would love to see a young adult reader book that features both Tamar and Jacob and gets shelved in a public library, because all of the book banners who think there should be room for only stories about one kind of family would tie themselves in knots figuring out what to do with this Bible story from a book they say they read and love. Ruth was another outsider. She married an Israelite who died during a time of famine, but she continued to live with her Israelite mother-in-law in a relationship of mutual support. She also knew that she would not be fully protected socially and economically unless she got married again. So with her mother-in-law's encouragement, she takes initiative with the Israelite Boaz, puts him in a compromising position. It was socially risky, perhaps dangerous, but again, her risk and her courage make room for the story to continue. No genealogy of Jesus without the story of Ruth. Bathsheba isn't even given a name in Matthew's genealogy, like he's highlighting what her prior social role had been, the wife of Uzziah. Readers do know the story. She was married to an outsider, Uzziah the Hittite, but who was fighting in Israel's army during a time of war. Bathsheba's story is so often told in churches in a way that would shame her and dishonor her. So let's be clear about this. A woman who is summoned to the chambers of a king is in the same kind of position as a person who is put into a cage with a lion. Is it hungry or has it been fed already? Either way, tread carefully. The Bible doesn't tell us anything about Bathsheba's overall feelings about David or how everything unfolded, how he arranged the death of her husband and took her as his wife. It does tell us she made clear that her son Solomon would be the one to take the throne after David, which gives her a pivotal role in the story of Israel and of Jesus. And of course, Matthew is about to tell us a story about Mary conceiving Jesus before she was married to Joseph or even living with him, and without any help from him at all. Who knew that a list of names could be so interesting and hold so much? As we begin our practice of Advent, looking at the stories we inherit and the stories that we make, we can notice something crucial in these generations listed by Matthew. The story of Jesus, we can make this claim pretty boldly after hearing all of these stories. The story of Jesus is held aloft with queer families as its pillars. It holds powerful people as well, the rulers, the respected, the respectable. But it's most notable because of who else shows up: the powerless, the marginalized, the outsiders, those who are resourceful and claim their own voices when they would have otherwise been silenced, those who assert their worth even though the systems they live in didn't necessarily see them as all that worthy. And if the gospel writers are correct when they call Jesus the child of humanity, or the human one, the one who most fully embodies and reveals what humanity is called to be and what our potential is, then I wager it's not in spite of those families, but because of them. Which means for us, too, whoever we are, whatever stories we're holding, the stories that we tell about ourselves, whatever stories we bring here, our stories can, and not only can, but should be brought here in all their fullness, in all their complexity, with all of their complications, and all of the stuff that makes us feel weird. When we bring our full selves into community, we are stronger. There is room for all of our stories here. And this is God's good news. Amen.